In telling the story of the world's first jet passenger airliner, we must travel back a further decade to another nation, a nation intent upon war. Five days before the invasion of Poland, Germany had already flown the world's first jet aircraft. Ernst Heinkel's HE-178 ushered in a new age. But from the German High Command, only lukewarm interest greeted Heinkel's jet prodigy. But, undeterred by such apathy, he pressed ahead with the building of a twin-engined jet fighter, the HE-280. Even as the Battle of Britain still raged, the airframe was completed. Mercifully, though, the development of its jet engines lagged months behind, and it was April 1941 before this revolutionary aircraft flew. With its many advanced features, including steerable nose wheel, pressurized cockpit, and ejector seat, nothing in the Allied armory could have matched it for a further 2 years. But the Reich's officialdom was unimpressed, for the prototype, fully laden with fuel and 20mm cannon, performed scarcely better than propeller-driven fighters. Heinkel promised speeds of 550 miles per hour for later models, but, incredibly, he was told to abandon the jet project and concentrate on conventional aircraft. Yet the potential of jet fighters could not be ignored forever, and in the war's closing years, the rival Messerschmitt company perfected another twin-engine jet, the famous Me-262. But from the outset, it was dogged by two major difficulties. The first was its axial layout turbojets, whose slimness gave good performance, but whose complexity gave endless problems. The second was Hitler. He remained skeptical of its capabilities until far too late. But although only about 200 ever saw service, the Me-262 was a fearsome opponent. Its speed made it almost untouchable, while its 4 huge cannon could punch great holes through Allied formations. Its courageous pilots became, perhaps, the world's first jet aces. In Great Britain, Frank Whittle's jet research paralleled Heinkel's, and in 1941 his Gloucester-Whittle prototype took to the air. Then, at government request, various companies worked feverishly to catch up with Germany. Gloucester's eventually produced the Meteor, while de Havilland's not only developed their own airframes, but also their own jet engines. Indeed, as early as 1943, they found themselves in the ironic position of supplying engines for this rival Meteor fighter.
The de Havilland company built one of the earliest jet engines during the war, and it was called the Goblin. And in parallel with Sir Frank Whittle's development of his engine, de Havilland's brought the Goblin to a practical stage where it first was used in the Vampire fighter.
Though it was early 1943 before construction on the Vampire began in earnest, by August the fighter was airborne. But it was not to be a jet aircraft's war, and the Vampire saw as little war service as its well-known Meteor counterpart. In May 1945, peace was declared, and the world rejoiced. It was a common holiday, and one wished to hope that war would never happen again. Yet, sadly, the atomic blast over Japan proved not to be the last page of the Second World War, but merely the first page of a new Cold War, with men seeking to go higher, further, and faster.
Seen from the quarterdeck of HMS Ocean, The Vampire approaches for the first jet landing ever to be made on a ship at sea in December 1945. Flagged off by the deck control officer, the Vampire gathers speed with deceptive slowness because the ship is itself traveling at over 30 miles an hour. To number 54 Squadron RAF fell the honor of making the first jet crossing of the Atlantic. Taking off in 2 flights from Odium in July 1948, the route lay by way of Stornoway, Iceland, Greenland, and Labrador. And this was the prelude to a tour of Canada and the United States and a return flight across the ocean.
But other, more fearsome frontiers of aviation were being crossed. The giant Ghost engine was grafted into a special Vampire to give it massive power, and an admiring world watched as John Cunningham coaxed the machine to well over 11 miles above the Earth's surface. No one had ever gone so high. It was a new world record.
The highest we've been to so far is 59,446 feet. At that height, the outside air temperature is something colder than that found at the North Pole, and the pressure of the air is a quarter that found on the ground.
Undercarriage half frozen by the extreme cold, Cunningham could hardly land the Vampire. After this, for the Ghost engine, powering an airliner at a mere 7 miles high would be easy.
Also, at the end of the war, the Havillands built a high-speed tailless research aircraft, which played a part in some of the flight development work that preceded the flight of the Comet. We developed some of the power controls that flew in the Comet. They were first flown in the third 108 that was built and used for research purposes.
In the matter of speed, we've been investigating the behavior of aircraft fitted with a gas turbine engine up to the speed of sound. We've brought back as much information as possible, partly from pilot's own report and also from an automatic recorder which contains a cine camera taking photographs of instruments in the aircraft.
By the end of the decade, so reliable had de Havilland's centrifugal turbojets become that the Goblin was approved for a 600-hour overhaul period, while its big brother, the Ghost, became the first jet engine to be trusted to passenger airline duty.
All the world's airliners were driven by propellers until the Comet came along. And in 1946, the Brabazon Committee proposed that the country should build a transatlantic mail carrier flying at 400 to 500 miles an hour. And the Havillands put their proposals forward, which were for a 4-Ghost-engined airliner, which was the Comet. Designers and aerodynamicists found that they could make a suitable 36 or thereabouts seater passenger aircraft that would fly at 500 miles an hour and could cross the Atlantic.
So, accepting the responsibility of producing an airliner as revolutionary then as the Concorde was to be decades later, the de Havilland Company had completed one of the most stringent testing programs ever associated with a passenger airliner. The basic shape was proved to be a sound design with wooden models, both scale and full size. A complete nose section was mounted on a wartime glider for visibility and windshield tests. A complete mock-up of the flight deck was used to determine ease of access to controls for pilots and navigators. Undercarriage tests on special rigs were made to determine safe and accurate handling on the ground, and a Ghost engine was even rigged behind a mock-up flight deck to evaluate noise levels.
The first flight of the Comet took place in July 1949, and it was a great moment to us, Hatfield, because the Comet combined in it various items, all of which we had flown in, perhaps in different aeroplanes before that. So there was nothing basically unknown to those of us who were about to fly it. I did 3 short hops in the morning, each hop just far enough into the air along the runway to satisfy myself that the elevators worked reasonably on the one hop, the second hop that the ailerons worked, and the third one that the rudder was effective. And in each hop I landed on the runway and stopped. At the end of that day, when our inspectors had satisfied themselves all was well with the aircraft, I took the aircraft up to 10,000 feet and was very satisfied with the handling and behavior of the aircraft.
So it was that the skies of an English summer first echoed to a new sound. On the 27th of July, John Cunningham's 32nd birthday, over the Hertfordshire countryside, the age of the passenger jet was born.
And at the end of that flight, I was able to fly down the runway so that the people from the workforce at Havilland at Hatfield who had watched the flight were able to enjoy it.
The principal team behind the Comet included men like Sir Geoffrey de Havilland himself, C.C. Walker, the technical director, men like Spittle, Kerr Wilson, Clark, Brodie, Arscott, and the man behind the development of the Ghost engine, Frank Halford. R.E. Bishop, who started as an apprentice with de Havilland and became a director as well as its chief designer. And it was the personal courage of men like John Derry and John Cunningham that led the world into a new era. It was the culmination of a successful decade for de Havilland, and although the air rang with the sound of fighter aircraft, it was the Comet that the crowds flocked to see at the 1949 Farnborough Air Show. C.C. Walker, Sir Geoffrey's chief engineer, sums up the promise of a new travel era.
It is evident now that the jet airliner, with speeds around 500 miles an hour, can be made to pay, and that such speeds are not just an expensive luxury. The jet engine burns a lot of fuel, but much less when it is operating at great heights. And the larger number of journeys, the more work which the fast aircraft can do in the year, reduces the cost of transport. In this new form of air travel, Britain has the chance to make up the leeway lost in the war, when we were developing combat aircraft to the exclusion of all else.
The normal speed that propeller-driven airliners flew at was about 250 miles an hour. The Comet, with its jet engines, flew at about 450 miles an hour, and at one stroke almost doubled the speed of an airliner. And I think the rest of the world looked with some surprise at the Comet's performance, and in America in particular, where they had not had very happy experiences with their jet engines in military aircraft, were rather surprised that de Havilland had produced a jet engine-driven airliner to carry passengers.
Surprised indeed, for as the Comet began its extensive trials program, the United States, as with this Boeing XB-47, had literally to power their jets into the air with rocket-assisted engines. Reverse thrust having yet to be perfected, and landing at high speeds, the heavy machine had to rely on the stopping power of a parachute. Such were the expectations of the Comet that even before the prototype had flown, production work had already begun on 16 others, 14 of which were for BOAC. These expectations began to be realized when, in October 1949, John Cunningham flew the Comet from London to Tripoli and back in a single day. 6 months later, the Comet was to set up a new point-to-point record between London and Cairo. With its airworthiness certificate obtained in 1952, its future was set, and on May the 2nd of that year, the world saw the first scheduled jet airliner service operating between London and Johannesburg in a little over 23 hours. The Comet 1 had reached BOAC a full 6 months ahead of schedule, and with interest spreading, UAT of France became the first overseas operator with the slightly higher capacity 44-seater Comet 1A. But suddenly, on May the 2nd, 1953, there came disaster. It was exactly a year after the inaugural flight.
The Comet 1 had 1 year entirely satisfactory service, and on the anniversary of its start of service with BOAC, a Comet taking off from Calcutta flew into a violent thunderstorm and failed structurally.
It was the worst disaster in the 13-year history of BOAC. Subsequent investigations determined, and eyewitnesses' accounts confirmed, that this tragic incident was, in the words of one report, an act of God. The Comet 1 had been the victim of a violent thunderstorm.
Rolls-Royce were meanwhile developing the Avon engine, which was somewhat more powerful than the Ghost and rather more fuel efficient.
De Havilland's introduced, on August the 27th, 1953, the new Comet 2, and world interest was justifiably sustained. But then...
Champino, this is George Peter, passing flight level 260 for cruising altitude 360.
Alright, J.O. Peter, passing flight level 260.
George Peter from George Howjig, understanding passing 260. What's the cloud cover? George Howjig from George Peter. Did you get my last?
That was the last heard from BOAC Comet 1 Yoke Peter, shortly after it took off from Rome's Ciampino airport. Less than a minute after Captain Alan Gibson's unfinished message to another BOAC aircraft, two fishermen off the coast of Elba witnessed the first blow that was to shake the very foundations of world civil aviation. "I heard 3 explosions," one fisherman said. "Then, several miles away, I saw a silver thing flash out of the clouds. By the time I got there, all was still. Yoke Peter was lost with all on board." In Great Britain, BOAC and the nation in general were shocked by the news. Ironically, it had been Yoke Peter that was used by BOAC for the inaugural flight of Comet services. But as the bodies of 15 victims were brought to the Isle of Elba by local fishermen, BOAC had no choice but to ground all its Comets. Witnesses were fine, but if there was to be more than mere speculation to go on, Yoke Peter would have to be brought to the surface. The Royal Navy vessel Sea Salver, with the most up-to-date salvage equipment on board, began an immediate search of the area. Back in Great Britain, the grounded comets had been thoroughly inspected, and some 50 modifications suggested. Reinforced shields were placed between the engines and fuel tanks, the fuel lines reinforced, and safeguards against the buildup of hydrogen were improved, and extra fire and smoke detectors fitted. But still there remained only speculation as to the fate of Yoke Peter. Even as the comets were being modified, the Royal Navy, using sonar and underwater television cameras, began to locate pieces of Yoke Peter's twisted carcass. By the end of February, they had retrieved a large section of the comet's tail, several seats, and 2 sections of fuselage from well over 400 feet of water. On March the 31st, the grappling hooks locked onto the entire forward section of the cockpit. The flight engineer was still strapped in his seat, and strangely, the cabin roof was missing. The pieces, which by now included engines, undercarriage, wing spars, and fuselage skin, were flown back to Great Britain and began to be assembled on the floor of a hangar at the Royal Aircraft Establishment at Farnborough. But on March the 23rd, Comets modified, BOAC resumed services. Every seat was taken. Confidence was restored in the Comet. The painstaking task of detailed reconstruction continued, and Yoke Peter began to take on an eerie shape. Just 2 weeks later, disaster struck again. Yoke, a Comet 1, crashed minutes after takeoff from Rome. This time it was night. There were no witnesses and no clues. The airworthiness certificate was withdrawn, and at parliamentary insistence, the investigation took on a new urgency. And although development was allowed to continue on the Comet 3, all work on the 2 was suspended indefinitely. There were 3 main lines of investigation: the wreckage, the detailed flight testing of another comet, and the pressure testing of yet another. The comet was made from over 1 million separate parts, any one of which might contain a vital clue. The Royal Navy had salvaged virtually 70% of Yoke Peter, but would it be enough? BOAC's impressed Comet 1, Yoke Uncle, was stripped of its furnishings, engines and equipment and delivered by road to Farnborough, where it was to be reassembled. It had flown about 3,500 hours, the same as the Elba comet. It was decided to construct a new type of test rig. A site was cleared and work started on a water testing tank of huge capacity. The idea was to fill the tank and aircraft with water simultaneously, and then increase the water pressure in the cabin to simulate the differential that occurs in normal flight. This tank, pressurized with air to the point of destruction, shows vividly what could have happened if cabin air pressure failed. The reassembled Yoke Uncle was wheeled to the partially completed tank. Since it was intended to simulate wing loading and wind gusting, it was necessary for the wings to protrude through the side of the tank to enable a certain amount of flexing. Lead ballast was added to Yoke Uncle to simulate passenger load, and final preparations were made for filling the tank. Once filled, the tests began that were to simulate 11 hours of pressurized flight every 21 minutes. Hydraulically operated mechanisms supplied the right amount of stress and load, which had been carefully calculated by analyzing the records of 2,000 flying hours of comets on BOAC routes. As the tank tests continued, the wreckage from the Mediterranean was examined minutely. Little by little, as the twisted parts were pieced together, some curious things were found. The impression of a 1 anna piece, probably from a passenger's pocket, was testimony to Yoke Peter's violent last moments. To support the investigations on the ground, an operational Comet, Able Victor, was subjected to an extensive series of flight tests. The passenger cabin was stripped of fittings, and recording instruments and strain gauges were applied throughout the aircraft. The pilots, all RAF officers of the Experimental Flying Department, were accompanied by civilian scientific staff from Farnborough and flying personnel from de Havilland's. The stringent tests required the aircraft to fly unpressurized. Structural vibrations were recorded, and measurements concerning the flying characteristics of the aircraft were made, together with engine temperature measurement and even cabin heating efficiency. Constantly, information from the ground tests was incorporated into the flight programs, and vice versa. These flight tests, all 70 of them, monitored activity at 60 different points in the aircraft, and over the period, Able Victor flew a distance equivalent to that twice round the world. Suddenly, when the equivalent to a full life of Yoke Uncle was about 4.5 times that of the Elba Comet, a major breakthrough occurred. A crack developed rapidly by a port side window, and suddenly the cabin was ripped open for a length of over 15 feet. This major failure confirmed that the structure of the escape hatches and windows was vulnerable, and metal fatigue was proved in subsequent laboratory tests to have been the cause. The examination of the Elba wreckage, proceeding simultaneously, confirmed that the failure started at a direction-finding aerial window in the roof of the cabin. The failure began in the rear one of 2 ADF windows and spread rapidly forward. On the other side of the window, the crack ran aft. The internal pressure forced the 2 halves upwards, and breaking away, they were projected violently along the wings. Paint traces and deep scratches in the salvaged wing confirmed the pattern of events. Then a portion of the fuselage structure was blown backwards by the airstream and struck the tailplane. The breakup of the aircraft followed rapidly. The rear fuselage came away folding downwards about the rear spar, and then fell into the sea with the open end downwards. The aircraft, now nose-heavy, dived towards the sea with its wings folding downwards. About the same time, the nose separated, and the center section, complete with engines, turned over and descended in a spin, landing upside down in the water. Great Britain's wonder plane, it seemed, was finished.
As a result of the grounding of the Comets and the withdrawal of the certificate of airworthiness, we lost the enormous lead that we had in world aviation. And it was 4 years before we got back into commercial jet business with the Comet 4. And as is very often the case with pioneers, the pioneer learns the hard way, and your competitors will learn from your own misfortunes.
In fact, on the 15th of July 1954, just 4 days before the prototype Comet 3 took to the air, the rival Boeing company launched what was to become the most popular jet airliner to date, the 707.
The Havilland Comet. No civil airliner has undergone a more intensive testing program. This version is the 3B. Notice the effect of reverse thrust from the 4 Rolls-Royce Avon jets as the huge airliner touches down. Now, the Comet 4.
By 1954, de Havilland's, fighting a rearguard action, began its Comet sales drive, and the world's buyers flocked to Farnborough. It was still one of the most advanced aircraft.
Soon after the Farnborough show, a Comet 4 completed the trip from Hong Kong to London in just over 16 hours, a record for the distance.
And so the eyes of the world were to focus once more upon the Comet. A year later, in December 1955, John Cunningham took the only Comet 3 produced on a world tour. Not only did the new Comet break existing records, it established many new ones. It was the first jet passenger aircraft to fly to Australia, the first to cross the Pacific and Atlantic, the first to travel around the world, and all in a little over a total of 53 flying hours. Meanwhile, the Royal Air Force, who had taken over the BOAC order for Comet 2s when the aircraft were grounded, were already stripping the airframes and strengthening them. Various modifications were made, and in June 1956, they entered service with Transport Command. It was soon apparent that the Comet 4's virtues, currently being enjoyed in the civil aviation world, were also ideally suited to a military support role. In times of tension, the military Comet 4's high speed and great carrying capacity enabled it to offer rapid support to other supply aircraft operating from distant strategic bases. Its efficiency enabled troops to be quickly deployed to the battle zone, its carrying capacity ensured adequate supplies of food, munitions and spares, and its speed enabled rapid repatriation for the injured in battle. For over a decade, the RAF and 14 foreign airlines, as well as BEA and BOAC, enjoyed and were well satisfied with the profitability and efficiency of the Comet 4 series. In all its variants, it had been a pioneer, a pace-setter, a milestone in world aviation. In its genesis, the Comet had shown all others the way. The disasters, horrendous even by today's standards, paved the way, painfully, to a safer future for the air travelers of the world. But the airlines' regular need to modernize their fleets eventually caught up with the Comet, and in February 1964, with sights set on new production horizons, Comet production ceased. It was no surprise that in the mid-60s, after careful consideration, the proven Comet airframe was chosen as the basis of an aircraft intended to replace a contemporary of the early Comet, the aging Lancaster-derived Shackleton. For the Comet itself, it was to be a new beginning.
My association started in the mid or late 1960s when I became a member of the development team for the Nimrod Mark I, and I was fortunate enough to fly on several of the fairly early sorties of the two development aeroplanes, one fitted with the Avon engines from the Comet 4C itself, and the other which was fitted with the Spays that we still fly with in the Nimrod today. Mark I proved to be a very effective performer from its very early days. It had really very few difficulties once it reached service. It was the most effective aeroplane and flew for 10 years with really remarkably little change. And indeed, we have an aeroplane now which has a fuselage, or a pressure hull at least, almost identical to the Comet 4C, very similar wings, but with extra fuel, more electrics, and a number of protuberances on the aeroplane to house the sensitive electronic equipment that we have.
The first of 43 Nimrod Mark I's flew from the British Aerospace Factory at Woodford on the 28th of June 1968 and immediately began to replace the Shackleton in the maritime role. It was the world's first land-based pure jet aircraft to be built for anti-submarine duties and long-range maritime patrol. With the increasing Soviet activity around Great Britain's shores, it became apparent that the sophisticated avionics equipment necessary to detect and monitor Soviet movements would soon have to be updated. EMI produced the highly advanced search water radar, and GEC Avionics were to update and continue to produce the highly effective anti-submarine warfare mission avionics. Of the original 43 Nimrod Mark I's produced, 32 were returned to the British Aerospace Manchester Works and completely gutted in order to house the new equipment, and the first conversion was redelivered to the RAF in August 1979. The performance was unchanged, but its effectiveness over the seas was enhanced beyond measure. In the book of Genesis, Cush begat Nimrod, and he became a mighty hunter. In its Genesis, the Comet begat Nimrod, and it, like its biblical namesake, proved itself to be a mighty hunter.
Captain Radar, high confidence snort, bearing 260, file number 4.
CTS homing.
System 1 clear pilot, action stations prepare for man. System 1 clear down. Takeoff order, CDS homing, file 004.
It's looking good, Nelson.
Roger. System clear, receiver check. And the DIP cams are 17, power 38, and low far 50.
Up until 1945, most of the U-boats sunk by aircraft had first been located on the surface, forced there by the need to recharge batteries. To catch one on the surface today is a rare occasion.
Captain Radar, contact lost.
Roger, radar.
Able to scan vast areas of ocean and identify targets with the aid of its own digital computer tied into the aircraft's totally new central tactical system, the Nimrod's ability to protect Great Britain's interests is staggering. Even under the waves, the enemy has no place to hide. The prying Nimrod electronics ensure that he remains the hunted, not the hunter.
Four bars, buckles, HRD on.
HRD on.
Stand by. Cams 17. Now, bow 38. Now, low far 55. Now.
Cams 17 is your system 1. Bar 3 is your system 2. Please run the data line.
Master available. Roger, high man. Rogers.
Encircled by sonar buoys, each sending back data to the onboard central processor, every tactic the submarine might employ is detected.
And on the circle, clear man.
Captain Acoustics, contact coming in active 17300 sector.
Roger, pilots, brake mad, steers in, tack track 300. Roger.
Contact coming through to you, bearing 325 degrees. Tracker is locked on.
Still hold man, Roger.
System 1 and BC enter.
Tack track 325.
Sensitive detectors spot minute anomalies in the Earth's magnetic field caused by the presence of the submarine.
And from the captain, down over the data looking for MAD.
There is no escape.
Tracking 310, and it's 1,300 yards on the point.
Yeah, from the captain, just put low far 54 down his throat.
Shutting down two of the Spey engines enables extremely long patrol lengths, for it's not just vessels beneath the waves that Nimrod monitors. The Soviet presence around Great Britain's shores often gives rise for concern, and the protection of friendly vessels, oil rig installations, and our own lifelines are watched over by Nimrod's keen electronic eyes. Potentially hostile shipping is constantly monitored, as well as extensively photographed. Electronic support measures housed in the tail of some Nimrods and in the wingtips of others provide essential information concerning hostile radar emissions, for Nimrod can protect itself too, should it sense itself to be under attack. Sidewinder air-to-air missiles form part of its self-defense system, along with its lethal Stingray torpedoes.
Mike 25, roger. Your clearance call.
X-ray 2 Romeo. X-ray 25, X-ray 2 Romeo on the stop.
X-ray 2 Romeo, this is Mike Victor 25, roger. Your clearance done.
X-ray 2 Romeo, clearance.
During times of war, Nimrod was called upon to protect the waters of threatened islands far from the British Isles. Flight duration was increased by the addition of in-flight refueling probes, and with its greatly extended range, Nimrod was a welcome addition to the forces in the South Atlantic patrolling the Falklands exclusion zone. To the casual observer, the delicate handling of the Nimrod and the flying skills necessary to complete the maneuver are breathtaking.
In contact, green on.
This is Mike Victor 25, indicating now you've had your fuel, you're clear to bring.
X-ray 2 Romeo, roger. Mike Victor 25, X-ray 2 Romeo is clear to stay.
2 Romeo, Sir Mike Victor 25, roger. 2 Romeo, this is Mike Victor 25, you're clear on the port.
X-ray 2 Romeo, roger. X-ray 2 Romeo on the port.
The success of Nimrod in monitoring surface and subsurface movements has been outstanding. In the North Sea and North Atlantic, recognized as the worst sea conditions in the world, Nimrod often operates at altitudes of just 200 or 300 feet. Yet this incredibly reliable hunter shows no sign of fatigue. Its welcome home is a thorough clean-off shower. The crew have to wait until after debriefing. But for the mighty hunter, there are also more passive tasks, and those that might doubt the value of the existence of such a force as Nimrod should take comfort in the fact that at least one aircraft and crew is permanently at readiness should a rescue incident at sea demand its presence. Again, with its greatly enhanced navigation and detection capabilities, Nimrod can locate and reach an incident at speed, shut down two engines, and maintain excellent low-speed maneuverability whilst advising the much slower rescue helicopters of the situation. Its complement of life-saving equipment stored in its huge bomb bay has helped to save the lives of hundreds in distress at sea. Nimrod also plays an active role in Nature Conservancy, and since 1975 they have flown 82 young birds from Norway to the UK as part of the RSPB and Nature Conservancy Council's 10-year project to resettle the rare sea eagle in the Inner Hebrides. Last year, patience was rewarded when a single chick was reared. Nimrod is now firmly established as Great Britain's mainstay of maritime reconnaissance, protecting the colossal investment around our shores. Performing its multifarious tasks with constant efficiency, it's destined to be a familiar sight in the airspace around our shores for decades to come. But this Comet descendant has itself given birth to yet another variant. Ungainly? Perhaps, but potentially the most advanced airborne technology in the world. The Royal Aircraft Establishment has long been associated with the Comet. Indeed, this odd variant, used for blind landing experiments, was once the Comet 3 that John Cunningham took on a world tour, and it was common sense that dictated another Comet be used for the joint GEC avionics, British aerospace venture, planned to revolutionize another sphere of Great Britain's and NATO's defense system, airborne early warning. The trials proved to be a success, and on the 16th of July, 1980, the AEW-3 prototype with its unique forward and rear radomes flew for the first time. Since the late 60s, the role of airborne early warning has been the responsibility of yet another variant of the original Comet contemporary, the AEW Shackleton. Fate has dictated that this latest descendant of the world's first passenger jet airliner is to replace the very last operational piston engine aircraft of the Royal Air Force. When it does so, its advanced avionics system will vault the United Kingdom ahead of its rivals into the 21st century.
Golf 65, Bomber, roger, report track 601, out. Bomber, this is Golf 65, new track, track number 335, position, November Kilo, Delta Juliet 3325, November Kilo, Delta Juliet 3325, tracking 200, speed 420, height 350, Scorpion modes 13 Charlie. This is Golf 65.
Golf 65, this is Bomber, your track 601, and now classified faker, intercept and engage.
65, roger. Op 6 TD, intercept and engage, faker 601 with mission 45.
Copy. 45, vector 070, target bearing 08075, heading 270, 35,000.
Skeptics should note that the highly advanced GEC mission avionics, designed exclusively for the AEW Nimrod, has already been chosen by the Lockheed Company as the system for the new AEW Hercules. It is the most complex avionics system ever to be put into an aircraft, and with its forward and rear-looking radar, will revolutionize airborne early warning.
Bomber 65, roger. Op 6 TD, intercept and engage, faker 601 with mission 45.
Designed with the overall European defense requirements in mind, the new Nimrod, with its unique pulsed Doppler radar system that can handle a multitude of different targets at the same time, is more than compatible with existing NATO AEW aircraft.
Faker 601, he's presently in Delta Lima, heading west, speed 550. You got it? TDR2 I have.
Some believe that Great Britain should have opted for the Nimrod's nearest rival, the E-3A Sentry, or AWACS, to fulfill our commitment to NATO. Time will tell. But certainly, as thoughts turn to the future of the aging AWACS, perhaps Great Britain stands once more at the threshold of becoming the leaders in the world of aviation technology. Collectively, there have been 49 Nimrods built, including 3 highly sensitive R1 variants used for electronic intelligence missions. In all, there have been 112 Comets built, an insignificant number compared with other first-generation passenger aircraft. But numbers aren't necessarily important when it's remembered that without the pioneering efforts of de Havilland and the work of the Royal Aircraft Establishment, aviation in general would not have reached the high standard of safety that the world today takes for granted. But as the Comet recedes into history, one must remember that to be reborn, phoenix-like from the awful experience of over 30 years ago, is a tribute to those who strove to get it right. In 1985, museums already hard pushed to maintain existing aircraft, Dan Air, the operator of the largest Comet fleet, said farewell to its last 4C.
I take great pleasure in realizing that all our efforts in the development of the Comet have not been wasted. Although we may not have achieved the sales that we had originally been hoped for, the Nimrod will continue to be a tribute to the original thinking that went into the Comet, and will also be a credit to the British aircraft industry.